Hey guys, I'm Yuruzi. Here's part 2 of What If Minato was the main character. When Naruto's father met his mother, his only impression was that a village out there must have been missing its idiot. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 4, A Test of Faith. A Chunin exam wasn't a proper Chunin exam unless the Forest of Death was involved somewhere. It was a place most genin had a healthy fear of, and it was understood that if you could traverse it from one side to the other and come out with all your body parts intact and mostly venom-free, you were roughly Chunin level or above. This was the real benchmark that would decide their capability as middle-class fighters, for if they couldn't fight their way through this, they had no hope. When they got the news early the next morning that they were to gather at the edge of the forest to await instructions, the genin were understandably horrified. Parents of 2 children decided to withdraw them from the test on the spot, which left just 18 candidates. This was some good news for the rest of them, as one of the first things they were told when they arrived at the checkpoint on the forest edge was that there were only 12 Chunin positions open and less competition was always welcome. But this meant that, regardless of whether they all performed perfectly or not, 6 of them would be going home empty-handed in the end. Minato looked around at the others who were all shooting furtive, calculating looks at each other, and he knew it was no coincidence that the examiners had chosen to reveal this rather important fact so late into the exam. The next test was, after all, a test of teamwork, and there was no better way to test teamwork than to subtly set them all against each other. Worst of all, the strict examiner was back. She stood against the fence, glowering at them all as if they'd offended her just by turning up. In the middle of this forest, she announced, there is an outpost. At this outpost will be 9 lockers, for which there are 9 keys, and everyone who gets inside one of these lockers and retrieves the item within will automatically pass this second test. As you may have noticed, only half of you can pass this test. And where do we find these keys? Nara Shikaku asked bluntly. You don't. They're right here. The examiner withdrew a crumpled white envelope from her pouch and tipped 9 small keys onto the dusty ground. They glittered in the strong morning light, and the genin stared at them like magpies. What are you waiting for? The examiner announced. Take them. There was only one beat of hesitation, then as one they all threw themselves forward into a shouting, squabbling pile at the woman's feet. The keys rapidly disappeared into tightly clenched fists, but it wasn't over. With only 9 keys and 18 genin, there was still a lot of squabbling and scratching, a few pained bleats as hair was pulled. Minato hung back. He knew an impending massacre when he saw it. Tenacious little Kushina, on the other hand, was right in the thick of it, biting someone's fist to get at their key. Enough, the examiner bellowed, enough to make the young ninja scuttle away. Who now has a key? 6 rather beat-up children raised their hands. There had to be 3 more, but they were wisely not going to advertise the fact. That's not fair. Yamanaka Inoichi protested, dabbing his split lip. If they have keys and we don't, then the test is already decided. If you wanted fairness, this wasn't the career choice for you, the examiner reprimanded him sharply. Your task now will be to capture a key for yourself. Those who already have a key, your task will be to keep it. Do not overestimate your advantage. It doesn't matter who starts out with a key at this point, only the superior among you will be holding one in the end. Now, you will be divided into teams of 3, as traveling through this forest alone is not recommended for ninja of your level, but ultimately do not forget that you individually need a key to pass this test, regardless of who else on your team has one. Then she strode among them, splitting them up quite randomly into sets of 3 by pushing them together. Minato was lumped with Inoichi and Shikaku, who had coincidentally been standing near him when the examiner passed, and looking at them both, Minato could see they both had something clenched in their fists. Inoichi was quite the poker-faced bluffer. A few meters away, Kushina had been paired with AI and one of the male Uchiha. None of them looked particularly happy about the fact, Minato thought, but then he noticed Inoichi and Shikaku were giving him a few unhappy glances. Well, if they had keys and he didn't, they were understandably concerned about being teamed with him. They probably thought he'd jump them both as soon as they were alone. Each team will enter the forest 5 minutes after one another. Those teams with members who scored highest in the last test will leave first. Which means you're up, the examiner said, pointing to Minato and his team. When the 3 boys just stared at her, she rolled her eyes impatiently. Go! Shoo! The clock is ticking. They jumped and began sprinting for the narrow gap in the fence that led into the trees. At the edge of the forest the vegetation was still quite sparse, allowing a lot of light and fresh air, but as they ran their surroundings quickly thickened. Deeper in the forest of death, the trees were thick and old and taller than the Hokage Tower. We have to put as much distance between us and the next lot, and find a good spot to come up with some strategies, Minato called to the other two as they ran. They said nothing, so he figured it was safe to assume the role of leader for this test. After a few more minutes, Minato brought them to a stop beside the mushroom-covered stump of a dead tree. "Here will do," he said. "Now. You both have keys, don't dash. Now!" Inoichi shouted. "Get him!" Minato tried to turn, ready to ward off attack, but found that he couldn't move. Not an inch. Out of the corner of his eye he noticed that a shadow was stretched unnaturally across the forest floor, attaching to his own. Shikaku had caught him in his family's trademark jutsu. Why are you doing this?" Minato asked, trying to fight the forces holding him in place. He didn't have much experience with this kind of jutsu. He didn't know how to break it. "I've got him, Inoichi, now it's your turn," Shikaku said form behind him. That was when Minato felt a very queer sensation creep over him, like he was being forced to take a step backwards, without ever moving, so that he was almost standing behind himself. His eyes did not look where he wanted to look. When he tried to speak, his mouth remained shut as if the connection between his brain and his body had been severed. "You got him?" Shikaku asked. "Yes," said Minato's mouth, though he had not instructed it to move. "You can let him go now." The shadows receded and Minato's body was now free to move and turn, yet still he could not control it. His eyes moved independently of his will and fixed on the crumpled form of Inoichi beside Shikaku. "Wow!" Shikaku looked enormously relieved, as if he'd just been incredibly nervous. "I don't believe we just got one up on Namikaze. I don't know how long I can hold him," Minato's mouth said. "Help tie me up, him up, Inoichi." Minato protested. "Get out of my head." "Sorry, Minato," said Minato, as he held his hands out for Shikaku to bind them. "It's nothing personal, it's just that you're a lot stronger than us, and you could have easily taken one of our keys. Me and Shikaku are going to the outpost alone. We'll be the first to pass. Don't forget his feet, Shikaku." "Is this a good idea? Leaving him tied up out here?" Shikaku wondered. "There's a lot of wild animals around here." "It's Minato. I guess you're right. I'm not invulnerable," he cried out, though no one seemed to hear him. If he'd been able to speak he would have warned them that they were dangerously missing the point of the test. It was their teamwork that was under scrutiny here, and yet the first thing they'd done was turn on a teammate. In minutes he was tied and gagged and bound against the soft, spongy cushion of mushrooms growing all over the tree stump. Inoichi came to and picked himself up off the ground, and Minato finally found he was able to move again, though the knots were too complex to all him much wriggle room. "No hard feelings, Minato," Shikaku said, as he and Inoichi raced away. Minato stared after them bleakly. Well, now what was he supposed to do? He could probably break free of these bonds, but it would be a waste of time and energy, especially when what he needed most right now was to find other people, and being so close to the starting point meant they would most likely find him in this place before too long. So he sat and mentally twiddled his thumbs, and indeed it wasn't too long before he heard leaves being crunched underfoot. Someone was approaching. Minato did his best to sit up and make as much noise through the gag as possible. At least he hoped it was someone rather than something. He'd feel pretty stupid if a giant millipede crawled out of those trees right now. Instead of a millipede, AI emerged. Thank God, he thought, and watched her stop to stare at him incredulously. "It's only Minato," she stage whispered to someone behind her. The Uchiha boy stepped out a moment later. "What's he tied up for?" the boy asked. I just shrugged. "Check if he's got a key," she said. "He's bound to have one." "You check," said the Uchiha. "This feels like a trap." Minato was beginning to think his contemporaries had a tendency to overestimate him. He raised his eyebrows at AI, who inched over like he was radioactive, and stopped barely close enough to reach out and pat his pockets. Satisfied he had nothing, she tugged off his gag. "Can you untie me?" he asked her. "Do you have a key?" she asked back. He felt his question was more pressing, but he answered nonetheless. "No." Shikaku and Inoichi probably overpowered him, which means they probably have keys. "Leave him there and we'll go after them," said the Uchiha. "Less competition is better." Minato looked between him and AI, And quickly it dawned on him that something was missing here, and not just a common sense of decency. "Where's Kushina?" he demanded. "Wasn't she on your team?" AI and the Uchiha looked at each other. "She was holding us back," he answered. "That's not the point," Minato said, feeling hot and angry and unusually close to losing his temper. "This is a team assessment. You can't just ditch your teammates. What do you care?" "You're not on our team," said the Uchiha. "Let's go." AI gave Minato an indifferent kind of shrug, as if to say none of it mattered anyway, and then they too abandoned him, setting off on the trail of Inoichi and Shikaku. Minato tried to look on the bright side. At least now he was no longer gagged. However, this was a small comfort as he sat amongst the mushrooms and fumed. It was a new experience for him, to be ditched by friends when normally they were scrabbling to be by his side. But it seemed that as soon as it benefited them, his so-called friends were only too happy to leave him high and dry. This, perhaps, upset him a little more than it should have. Before too long he heard stomping footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. Minato held his breath. That sounded far too noisy and careless to be one of the genin. He hoped to God it wasn't a tiger. Oh. Only Kushina. He should have known. The small redhead shoved a branch aside to step into his clearing and then stopped to witness his sigh of relief. "Oh," she said, not looking particularly surprised. "You're all tied up." "Yeah," he said. "Can you untie me?" Unlike AI and the suspicious Uchiha and his cutthroat teammates, Kushina didn't appear to have even a moment's second thought before walking over to begin hacking at his bonds with the kunai. When he was free, she even took his hands and scowled at his wrists as she checked them over for any injuries that might need first aid. "Did you get jumped by your team?" she asked. "Yeah," he sighed. "They had keys and I didn't. They figured it would be better to get rid of me. But I just saw your team going after them." "Did they ditch you too?" She wrinkled her nose. "No. They tried to take my key so I ran." And to prove it, she produced a little silver key from her pouch and held it up for him to see. Under these circumstances, it seemed kinda stupid. Didn't she know people were being ambushed and tied up over these things? He stared at her rather than the key. "Aren't you worried I'll try to take it off you too?" She looked at him thoughtfully, as if it really hadn't occurred to her. "No, and that was that." She helped him stand and patted him free of clinging leaves, dirt and mushroom spores. She was so totally at ease that he realized the choice now was obvious. "We'll have to form our own team if we want to complete the test," he told her. "Would you mind helping me capture my own key?" "Sure," she said with a shrug. "You don't mind?" "You could go straight to the outpost from here and win if you wanted," he reminded her. "Well, yeah," she said slowly. "But you need a key too, and if I stick with you, there's less chance someone will take mine away. I think your team must have been pretty stupid. Most people round here would kill to have you on their side. Only when it suits them," he said darkly, and they set off together through the forest towards its center. They were heading in the direction of the outpost, not because they wanted to go there, but because this was undoubtedly where anyone with a key was heading as well. Sooner or later they would have to come across someone who. "Did you hear that?" Minato whispered, bringing them both to a silent stop in the shadow of a boulder. Kushina listened intently, until she heard the soft whispering huffs too. "Tiger," she mouthed at him, but Minato wasn't quite so sure. It seemed awfully close, and to the best of his knowledge, tigers didn't cry. He moved silently around the boulder and peered down into a wide hollowed-out log that was undoubtedly older than their village. The dark-haired girl crouched inside it didn't notice him until he softly called her name. "Mikoto? Are you alright?" She twisted to face him, eyes wide and wet. Kushina dropped down beside him to look into the log as well. "Do you think she has a key?" she asked. "Kushina," he admonished lightly. "I don't think now's the right dash." "I don't have a key," Mikoto said tremulously, rubbing her eyes. "I had one but Hyuga Hayashi took it. Him and his brother kicked me off the team." "Join the club," Minato sighed. "How can I pass the test if I don't have a team?" she exclaimed despairingly. "If I don't pass, my dad's going to be really mad. He was boasting to Fugaku's parents about how good I was, but if I can't even pass the Chunin test, my life is over." "Over? Already?" Kushina echoed incredulously. "Why don't you join our team?" Minato asked her. "Me and Kushina were going to get a key for me, but it's no more trouble to help you get one as well." You don't mind? She sniffed. Kushina made a sound like she was thinking of protesting, but Minato shot her a sharp warning look. Best behavior. He mentally pleaded. Surely she hadn't forgotten the promise she'd made to be nice to Mikoto? Apparently not. Kushina swallowed hard and then suddenly thrust her key at Mikoto. You can have mine, if you want, she said quickly. You really don't mind? Mikoto whispered, amazed. It's not fair your own teammates stole your key, Kushina told her. Your brother just tried to take mine too, so we're all outcasts. Now we can work together and get our own back. Me and Minato will worry about getting our keys. You just back us up, okay? Come on. Minato reached down to help the dark-haired girl out of the hollow. With the three of them together they were a proper team again and he didn't feel quite so hopeless anymore. Perhaps they wouldn't deduct too many points for ending the test in a different team than when they'd started. The important thing is to stick together, he told the girls. We don't split up until all three of us have keys, right? Whose keys are we going to go for? Your teammates had some, didn't they? Kushina asked. Yes, but AI and Mikoto's brother are after them as well. Hayashi and Hizashi went that way and I know they both have keys, Mikoto said, pointing to the north. I don't think anyone would dare go after them normally, but, Minato shrugged. They're not so tough. The two girls looked at each, both realizing that only someone like Minato could take the Hyuga twins so lightly. Even the most talented of the Uchiha were pretty wary of the prodigies of their cousin clan. The most important thing to know, and perhaps the only thing you needed to know about Hyuga, was that they could see through solid objects, including the back of their heads. It was virtually impossible to sneak up on them, which made them incredibly difficult targets to steal keys from. But virtually impossible wasn't the same as impossible. We better keep going towards the outpost, Minato told the girls. I'd rather not come across the Hyuga twins if we can help it, but we'll take anyone we can get. If we assume that everyone with a key will be wary of being ambushed between the east entrance of the forest and the outpost, they might try to approach the outpost from the west. So it was decided that they would head directly for the outpost and work out ways to ambush the remaining teams. It was a 15-minute journey, and from the cover of the canopy they could see the mammoth tree that had been hollowed out and converted into a building, one which could have easily even overlooked as an outpost if not for the row of lockers lined up near the churning roots. There were 9, though 3 looked as if they had already been opened. Then there's only 6 keys left, Mikoto whispered, because Minato had said he sensed another keyless team nearby who seemed to have the same idea as them. I wonder which team is already through, Kushina sighed, slumping down against the trunk of the tree they were sitting in to scratch at itchy scalp. Doesn't matter. Being first is not everything, Minato said, feeling a little hollow as he said it, because he wasn't used to being anything but first in everything. We'll be second with any luck. Kushina grunted and settled in to discreetly fan her hot glowing face after their sprint through the forest. Minato kept watch. Minutes ticked by, and the forest was filled only with hot, damp air and a million insects. Somewhere in the distance the trees quivered and an enormous red-black body hunched through the undergrowth like an overgrown worm. Which was probably exactly what it was. But as long as they were in the trees they were relatively safe from the predators in this forest who were mostly ground-dwelling. The real danger came only from other genin, and although they waited half an hour, no one turned up. If Hayashi and Hizashi had been exactly where Mikoto said they were, they'd had plenty of time to reach the outpost by now. No doubt they were hanging back, anticipating ambush. They would have to appear eventually, however. There was a time limit on this test. Kushina plucked at her lip impatiently. Where is everyone? She complained. We're going to fail at this rate. I hope not, Mikoto said apprehensively, hugging herself tightly. She seemed to be thinking of the trouble she would be in again. Kushina shot her a skeptical look. How come your dad would be so mad, anyway? She asked. It's not like it's a big deal if you don't pass first time. Minato glanced distractedly over at her new teammates, saw Kushina's genuine confusion and Mikoto's discomfort and gave a small cough. Mikoto is part of the Uchiha clan, Kushina. This meant nothing to her. Doesn't mean her dad doesn't need to take a chill pill, she said, scowling. I don't believe someone who loved you could be that angry at you. But Kushina did not understand that being a parent did not always guarantee love, nor did love guarantee affection and a soft hand. There could be fathers like Minato's who neither loved nor cared how their child fared in their examinations. Then there were fathers like Mikoto's who cared a little too much. Minato wondered where Kushina's own father fell, had she ever known him. Well, Mikoto said quietly, if I fail, it'll be a blow to my family's credibility. Then Fugaku's parents might change their minds. Uchiha Fugaku? Minato asked. He's one of the police commanders, isn't he? Don't like him, Kushina said shortly. It was no secret that she'd had more than one run-in with the police in her time. He's going to be the next clan leader, Mikoto told her. And if I uphold my family's reputation, we'll be married. Kushina's mouth dropped open. But he's old. He's like 20 or something. The marriage was arranged when I was born, Mikoto went on. Age doesn't really matter, but that shouldn't be allowed. Kushina turned beseechingly to Minato, as if appealing to his authority. That can't be allowed. Everyone should be allowed to choose who they marry. Minato shrugged uncomfortably. All the old clans had their peculiar traditions that seemed right out of the arc and he'd never really thought much about it. If Mikoto is happy with it, Kushina looked demandingly at Mikoto, who recoiled a little nervously. I'm not unhappy. She offered vaguely. Our clan has to protect our bloodline limit and make sure it doesn't get diluted and weakened. Arranged marriages are occasionally necessary to strengthen the clan. Kushina remained unimpressed. The Hyuga clan are way worse, anyway. Mikoto mumbled. Do you even like Fuguface? She demanded. I'm not. I haven't really spoken to him. Barbaric. Kushina declared. My village never would have allowed this. Mikoto, when I restart Whirlpool again, you may come and live there with me. If you want. Fuguface isn't invited. Mikoto blushed. Thank you, she whispered, probably more taken with the gesture than the actual offer. Even Minato grinned. He had yet to be invited to the paradise that was Uzumaki Kushina's new Whirlpool village, so it looked like she was taking her duty to be civil to the Uchiha girl very seriously. A subtle movement somewhere deeper in the forest caught his eye. He glanced over, expecting it to be another mottled panther or a giant earwig, you know, the usual, and saw, with a thrill of anticipation, that it was another team. Quickly, holding his finger to his lips so the other girls would know to be quiet, he beckoned them closer. I think it's the Hyuga twins, he whispered. They'll see us. Mikoto whispered back. I've trained with Hayashi and Hizashi, and I don't think they can see much beyond 60 meters, he said quietly. But presumably they both have keys. This could be our best chance. I think we should wait for someone else, Mikoto said. What's the worst that could happen? Kushina reminded her. They escape with the keys. We might as well try. The worst that could happen is they blow our organs out with the gentle fist technique, Minato corrected absently. It'll be hard fooling the Byakugan, and they'll be expecting ambush at this point. I know, Kushina, get down there and create a distraction. What did you just say about organs? She hissed, face white. What? He feigned innocence. Minato, I like my organs unblown out, she insisted. That won't happen. You have me to back you up, remember? But if we're going to get those keys, you'll need to create a diversion, so like a soldier resigning herself to the final charge, Kushina pushed herself upright on the branch, nodded solemnly to her new teammates, for it was certainly the last time she would see them while her organs were intact, and dropped down through the tree silently to catch up with the twins and confront them. Minato turned to Mikoto. Keep an eye on the other keyless team, he said, pointing to the other team still hidden away, who seemed unaware of either their presence or the arrival of the Hyuga boys. They might make a move while I'm distracted, so shout if they act, or dash. Oi! Hand over those keys right now. Oh, dear. Kushina apparently took her job awfully seriously. Minato had to abandon Mikoto and scramble down the tree to see Kushina standing some distance away, confronting two rather amused-looking boys. Her fists were up, her brow was furrowed, and she meant serious business. Give me the keys or else, she shouted at them. Minato was almost too far away to hear one of the twins' laughing response. Or what? Or what? Kushina screamed her war scream, something that never failed to make everyone within 100 yards flinch, and charged. It was hopeless, but she had the two boys' full attention. That was all Minato wanted and needed. He shot forward. Sometimes Minato moved so fast that everything else appeared to slow down in comparison. He saw Kushina running, but even though she was closer to the twins she wouldn't reach them before he did. And although he entered the Byakugan's field of vision, it seemed to take an age for the boys to notice and begin turning towards them, just in time to receive Minato's fist to the face and stomach respectively. It was no gentle fist technique. Hayashi staggered, clutching his jaw, and Hisashi dropped to his knees, wheezing. Kushina chose that moment to launch herself like a fierce little Amazon onto Hayashi's back with a kunai to his throat. Hand over the keys, nice and slow, no funny stuff, she demanded with full authority. Since Hisashi was close to passing out, Minato rifled through the boy's pockets and pouches until his light fingers found the tiny silver key they were looking for. While Hayashi struggled and turned in circles in desperate attempts to dislodge his unwelcome passenger, Minato calmly took a coil of wire and tied up his twin's hands behind his back. "Get off me, you ginger freak!" Hayashi finally grabbed Kushina's arm and threw her. Minato slammed him into a tree with his shoulder and quickly performed a genjutsu through their skin contact to subdue the Hyuga. Almost at once the boy sagged, staring catatonically off into the distance like he'd gone to sleep without remembering to close his eyes. Minato turned immediately to Kushina, who was sitting up a few meters away, leaves in her hair and a troubled look on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked quickly. A perplexed Kushina showed him her floppy arm. She'd clearly been touched by a gentle fist move that had sealed the chakra point inside her wrist. But this did not apparently concern her as much as he'd assumed. "Not ginger." "What? I'm not ginger," she complained. "I'm red. And I'm not a freak either." Freakishly brave, perhaps, taking on opponents twice her size and strength without pause or consideration, but certainly not a freak. And did it matter what name people gave to her hair color? It must have looked the same beautiful red to everyone else as it did to Minato. He smiled reassuringly as he crouched down beside her. "Let me see that arm." She willingly handed him her floppy limb. "The feeling will come back pretty soon if you keep rubbing it like this," he told her, running his thumb firmly against the inside of her wrist, almost to her elbow. Kushina turned a little pink in the cheeks and quickly took her arm back. "I got it," she said quickly, taking over from him. He was about to ask why she didn't like his touch, but Mikoto's scream interrupted his thoughts. "Minato," she screamed. "Look out!" He stood up quickly and turned to see two genin stumble out of the trees and stagger to a halt at the sight of him. "Damn!" said one. "Shit!" said the other. They were the keyless team who'd been waiting for just this kind of opportunity to ambush someone. Yet it seemed they'd forgotten what they were doing the moment they realized the one they were ambushing was none other than the most powerful genin in the forest. "Need something?" he asked. The two boys shuffled their feet a little. You wouldn't happen to have any spare keys, would you?" one of them asked. "Sorry." "He's got one," he said, nodding to the drooling Hayashi, "but we're taking it." "Ah, no problem, no problem. We'll just keep on looking, won't we?" one boy said quickly, with far too much cheer as he pushed his partner back towards the forest. "Sorry to bother you." They were gone almost as quickly as they'd arrived, and Minato exchanged a mild shrug with Kushina. He crouched down and extracted the last key from Hayashi's pouch and held it out to show Mikoto when she dropped down from the tree above. "We have all the keys we need now," he told the girls. "Let's find out what's in those lockers." "Me first." Kushina grabbed the key he held out with her functioning hand and wheeled off in the direction of the outpost. "Last one, there is a rotten fish." Mikoto, cheered at the sight of her unconscious former teammates, took off after Kushina with a laugh, and Minato, not really minding if he was declared a rotten fish, followed behind. It turned out that the three genin who had beaten them had been none other than Subaru and his teammates, Juza and Chichi. They were the only team who had made it from start to finish without falling to pieces. Most of the other genin arrived alone or in pairs, and Minato felt some unusual satisfaction to see Shikaku and Inoichi turn up after the deadline, having lost their keys to none other than the Hyuga twins. Ai and her Uchiha arrived with only one key between them, which caused a tremendous fight outside the tree as they fought over who would open the locker. Ultimately, as Minato had suspected, it didn't matter. Points were indeed awarded to those who had ended the test with keys, but more points went to those whose teams had survived, so that a team who had arrived at the outpost with no keys at all were individually given more points than those such as the Hyuga boys who had evicted their comrade. Naturally, this didn't go down awfully well with those who had gone to great lengths to stab their teammates in the back for a key, but it meant Minato and his team were awarded maximum points despite their unconventional alliance. And most importantly, Minato's perfect score was intact. Something his sensei took great delight in. Subaru, Minato, Jiraiya sensei grabbed the shoulders of his students passionately. You are definitely boys after your sensei's heart. AI, who had been standing there with her arms folded and her foot tapping for quite some time, made a disgusted sound and stormed away. Minato felt a little sorry for her flunking the second test like that, even if her betrayal of Kushina had been to his own advantage. In retrospect, that was probably what bugged her the most, not that she'd failed, but because she'd failed in such a way that had guaranteed him a perfect win. I'm sure she'll see the funny side one day, Minato-sensei whispered to him. I never could seem to get through to her about the whole teamwork thing though. Perhaps that was because Jiraiya had not been teaching AI or Subaru as long as he'd taught Minato. In fact, Minato couldn't actually remember a time when Jiraiya hadn't been his sensei, since he'd been placed extraordinarily early with a Jonin teacher after frankly scaring some of his early academy teachers with his ability to teach them a thing or two. AI and Subaru hadn't joined him for several years, when it was then decided that Minato would benefit from a team, and Air and Subaru would benefit from him. In some ways that had worked. In others, it really hadn't. AI's a decent fighter, Minato said encouragingly. She'll probably do much better in the next test. Even if she doesn't, these tests are a learning experience in themselves, Minato, his sensei pointed out. People grow from failure as much as success. That's something I fear you don't have nearly enough experience with. You want me to lose the next test? Minato offered. Ah, no, you're okay. Further along the fence that bordered the Forest of Doom, Minato could see Kushina with her own sensei, receiving praise. It was strange to see her looking so bashful, looking down at her shoes as her sensei patted her head. He had to take back all the apprehension he'd felt about Hatake Tsukumo's teaching methods. The man was clearly very soft on Kushina. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't scary towards everyone else, so Minato hung back and waited for him to leave before detaching from his sensei to approach Kushina. She was still glowing with pleasure and pride when he sidled up beside her, clutching the token from the locker she'd opened against her mouth. What do you suppose those mean? He asked her, holding up his own identical token. It was nothing more than a piece of card with a number written on it. In his case it was the number 2. Kushina apparently had the same number, but he'd noticed that other genin had different numbers. Dunno, Kushina flapped her card, fanning her grubby, sweat-streaked face. Kinda lame. I thought there would be piles of gold in those lockers or something the way everyone was carrying on. Disappointed, don't know what I'd do with a pile of gold, she admitted. Probably buy some new shoes. As she looked ruefully down at her mud-caked sandals, Minato smiled. You know, you're in the top 5. Your sensei looked pleased. She wrinkled her nose. I think he's kinda worried really. That surprised him. Why would any teacher be worried about his student doing well? He doesn't want me to be a Chunin really, she explained at his puzzled expression. Chunin have to fight the wars. 95% of the ones getting killed are Chunin. Sensei reckons it's a death sentence to pass the exam at a time like this. If you get called up, that's the end of it. Such odds had never concerned Minato, but suddenly he understood that taking this exam could demand a whole lot more courage from someone like Kushina than someone like himself. If he was called up, he'd be okay. But even he had had a few anxious thoughts about his friends in the same position. Are you worried? He asked her. No, she protested. I'm not a coward, but she wasn't totally indifferent. That was plain to see in the apprehensive scowl on her face. Her mouth regularly told some whopping lies, but Kushina's face was a wonder in its expressiveness. You can always drop out, he suggested idly, hoping he didn't sound like he was questioning her ability. She glared at him. If I get left behind, you might threaten to tutor me again. Not if I get called up, he reassured her. Her eyes fluttered shut and she half turned away from him. Don't joke about that. Minato gaped at her like one of her beloved fish. He'd struck a raw nerve, but why? How could anyone worry about him getting called up? Genin, the stern examiner was back. She had appeared by the gates they had originally assembled around and was snapping her fingers for attention. Gather round, please. Let's get this over with. The genin obediently scuttled around her, at a safe distance of course, and observed the respectful kind of dead-eyed silence that this examiner expected of them. Now, she began, those of you who opened a locked should now have a card and a number in your position, correct? This is your reward for obtaining a key and will be vital for the third and final test which, as you should know, will be a battle tournament taking place a week from now. Each of you holding a number will notice that there will be one other person holding the same number. The card-holding genin looked around, and Minato, already knowing who held the same number, looked at Kushina. These numbers indicate your first opponent. Take a long, hard look at the person holding your number, for you will face them in 1 week. You have been given the opportunity to study their strengths and weaknesses, so use this advantage wisely. Astonished and excited mutters broke out among the genin. Kinda glad I lost that key, Shikaku could be overheard saying. Wouldn't like to be the kid who drew against Minato. Kushina's eyes snapped on Minato, all the color draining from her face. He swallowed. Kushina. But what was left to say? The red-haired girl turned and stormed away, a few jeers and laughter following her, since the exam was as good as over for her. She wouldn't even pass the first round of the tournament. The sharp-edged examiner barked them all back into submission, but the damage was done. Kushina had been quite tolerant of Minato in many ways, but he doubted she would forgive him for this. Chapter 5, A Test of Strength. Kushina did not speak to him once that week. He had seen her several times down in the training yard, practicing furiously with her apparently bottomless well of energy. She'd turned into a steely, determined drone, one who no longer registered his existence beyond the fact that they were matched together in the first round of a tournament that was rapidly approaching. And not only was Kushina refusing to speak to him, but AI too also bore a grudge against him for figuring out the spirit of the second test. Subaru wasn't talking to him either, come to think of it, but since that was normal, Minato didn't worry too much about this. He instead clung close to his sensei's side for that week, wheedling him to practice some basic moves that he could already perform blindfolded, or else just leeching his company. It seemed like his sensei was the only one who liked him these days. Even Inoichi and Shikaku were avoiding him, ashamed as they were of backstabbing him, and perhaps a little wary of vengeance. Everyone else was simply too busy preparing for the final test to bother much with him, or perhaps they too were avoiding him almost superstitiously, as if speaking to him might invoke the wrath of the gods of probability, resulting in them being paired against him in the tournament. Hold this for me, Minato, Jiraiya-sensei said, handing his student his binoculars as he resettled on the library rooftop. This was his new hobby, he'd said. Ornithology. Apparently that meant bird watching, but his sensei seemed to be ignoring a perfectly valid-looking hawk hanging out in a nearby tree in favor of watching a whole other kind of bird. So while most of Minato's friends were buckling down and training hard for the coming tournament, Minato was assisting his sensei in spying on his own teammate, the village's most beautiful and violent, Kunoichi Tsunade. Although, he told himself, he was only doing this because if he didn't help his sensei in his endeavors to be the village's biggest sex pest, there was a good chance that this particular woman would kill his sensei. But now there was also the good chance that she would kill Minato too. Maybe we could do something else, sensei, he said warily, keeping an eye on the apartment opposite. Like what? Aren't there other women, less dangerous women? Minato, Jiraiya sighed, taking back the binoculars to refocus on his teammate's apartment window. When twitching, one does not seek out a common blackbird when there is a bird of paradise about. If Tsunade was a bird of paradise, what kind of hellish version of paradise did this refer to? And if a bird could punch a hole in the Earth's crust, one should really evaluate their ornithological hobby and see if there weren't any safer, less fatal alternatives. Like knitting. Jiraiya-sensei really might enjoy knitting if he just got. Dear God, get down. Sensei's large hand landed on top of his head like a brick, and they both flattened themselves against the rooftop as the elusive, lesser-spotted blonde came to her window and pushed it open. She didn't appear to notice the pair of gargoyles on the library rooftop. Perhaps because she was a little preoccupied by the pale-haired man who came up behind her to playfully wrap his arms around her waist. It appeared that they'd come across some sort of mating dance. Dan, Jiraiya-sensei sighed disgustedly, lowering his binoculars as if he could no longer stomach the sight. What a fungus. Remind me to ask the Hokage to send that guy on a suicide mission. Can we do something else? Minato asked, because this development might mean his sensei was finally open to other activities. Jiraiya-sensei sighed even more loudly. I guess, he intoned. I should be training you anyway. Haven't you got some sort of test next week? Where's AI and Subaru? Trying to train in secret, Minato said glumly, they're kinda avoiding me. Ha! After seeing Dan so unexpectedly, Jiraiya-sensei was a little low-spirited for the rest of the day, though he willingly went along with Minato to a meadow outside the village to resume work on his stamina, one of the few areas left he had that needed any improvement. Well, that, and his mutiny radar which had proven itself awfully rusty in the last test. Yes, he was still quite bitter about that. After 3 hours of intensive ninjutsu work, Minato collapsed into the grass beside his sensei, sweat damp in his hair and his joints aching from so much discharged chakra. He glanced across at the older man and saw he was scribbling something into his notebook, tongue between his teeth. "What are you writing?" Minato panted. It didn't seem like his customary fiction writing, since he wasn't sniggering or leering. "Once upon a time," said his sensei, "a large toad asked me to chronicle my whole life." Minato blinked. That hadn't been the answer he'd expected. "Why?" "Because he said one day I would have a student who would either be the world's salvation or bring about the world's destruction." He raised an eyebrow at Minato. "I don't think I'll destroy the world," Minato said thoughtfully. "I was worried about you once," Jiraiya admitted to him. "A lot of boys in your position, who are born exceptionally gifted by a mere stroke of luck or the whim of a divine hand, they grow to be corrupted by their own power. They turn arrogant and narcissistic, utterly convinced of their own perfection and genius and contemptuous of anyone and everyone weaker than themselves, as if the only measure of a human being is power." Jiraiya took a deep long sigh and looked up at the cloudless sky. For a long time he said nothing, and Minato wondered if he was thinking of someone he knew. Perhaps Orochimaru-sama? Everyone knew of the tumultuous relationship between those two men. Frankly, Minato had had more than a few nightmares about the pale-faced, snake-eyed man. There was no doubt he was incredibly gifted, perhaps even more so than Jiraiya-sensei, and that wasn't fair. Why should the heartless man be the stronger of the two? Although perhaps that was what Jiraiya-sensei was trying to tell him. Those who had more power felt the temptation to dominate others the most because they could. "You're not like that," his sensei said at last. "I wish I could take credit for it, Minato, but I don't think you were born with a bad bone in your body." But that didn't strike Minato as entirely true. He didn't believe that a person was born a certain way and could never change. Surely people were formed by the others around them? That was why wars started generations ago were still going on, because the old generation passed their hatred onto their children. Who Minato was had been decided by the people who had raised him, and at the root all his memories, and all the thoughts and philosophies and warnings and advice that he'd taken into his heart, was his sensei. And for as long as he could remember, Minato knew the only person he had ever wanted to be when he grew up was Jiraiya. How could the man not see that? "You probably get it from your mother," his sensei continued blithely. "I don't think there was a time when the whole village wasn't in love with her. Or maybe you take after your father, your real one, I mean. Whoever that is, it's you." Jiraiya-sensei sat bolt upright, looking horrified. "Minato, I swear, I never touched your mother." "No. I mean, you're as good as." Minato said, looking away and feeling extremely hot in the face in a way that couldn't be accounted for by the strenuous training. "My dad, I mean." Jiraiya stilled for a moment and then looked away too. Now Minato had no idea what to say. An awkwardly touched silence had fallen between them, and he couldn't help but smile and bite his lip as his sensei cleared his throat gruffly and said, "Big brother, maybe. I'm way too young to be your dad, I guess." A large bear-sized hand landed on his head to ruffle his hair and they grinned at one another before falling into a more companionable silence. Jiraiya returned to his book, Minato returned to staring at the sky, wondering about the imminent tournament and just what the hell he was going to do about the first round. He was up against Kushina, for goodness sakes. He would win, of course. It was just a question of how to go about it. He could defeat her quickly, as if she were any other opponent. She might prefer that over being patronized if he pulled his punches and let her land a few. It was out of the question to deliberately lose to her. She had her pride, and besides, he didn't really want to see her become a Chunin. A small sigh escaped Minato, unbeknownst to him. His sensei picked it up easily enough. "What's up?" Minato was glad he'd asked. He'd been wanting to confide his troubles with his sensei, he just hadn't known how to break it. "What do you think the chances are that we'll be called up after we become Chunin?" he asked. His sensei looked surprised. "Are you worried?" "Not for me." "Ah. Your friends?" Jiraiya-sensei nodded with a knowing twinkle in his eye that suggested he knew exactly which friend Minato was most worried about. At least he'd had the decency not to say, "You're Kushina again." That had been embarrassing. "It's natural to be worried. I'm a Jonin and most of my friends are Jonin, and I still worry about them. But do you think any of the new Chunin will be sent to the front lines?" Minato persisted. "I mean, even if some of them have the technical skill to pass, none of them have really gone up against a real enemy before, and that's hugely different from sparring with dummies full of straw." "Yes," Jiraiya-sensei said slowly. "But it's not something I can be certain of, Minato. The Hokage is a very reasonable man. I can't see him sending off a fresh batch of Chunin to the front lines when there are still more experienced reserves available, but, But, well, you know, relations with the Rain country haven't been very good lately. Their leader, Hanzo, is spoiling for a fight and it doesn't look like he'll back down. It's possible that we'll be at war with them too by the end of the year, and with the number of supporters he has, it would take all our reserves and more to match him. At which point, yes, it might be very likely that your classmates will be sent to fight. Oh. Minato began worrying his lip, but his sensei continued emphatically, that's just a worst-case scenario. There's a good chance that Hanzo will pick a fight with Suna or Iwa instead, so I'm sure we won't have to deal with another war and your friends will be safe. Look on the bright side of things, Minato. Worrying will just give you an ulcer. Minato wanted to believe his sensei, and so he did. Unfortunately, Jiraiya's reassurances proved to be a little empty, as war did break out between the Fire Country and the Rain Country before the end of the year. In fact, it broke out only 3 days after that conversation in the meadow, during the last test of the Chunin exam of all times. And Minato was the cause. Sleep had not come easy the night before the tournament. For hours he tossed and turned, listening to his father's snores in the other bedroom, and worrying. Constantly worrying. He'd never worried like this for any other test, like any other normal child, and unlike any other normal child he was not worrying about doing his best and passing. Instead he was contemplating doing his worst and risking failure. Minato went downstairs and warmed a glass of milk, hoping that would send him off. When it didn't, he gathered his blanket and went to stretch out on the floor, hoping it would simulate those long nights spent camping with his team when he never had any trouble falling into a happy, contented sleep. When this failed, he punched his pillow repeatedly and growled aloud. Why him? Why him? What had he done to deserve being cast against Kushina, so that anything he did tomorrow would end in her never speaking to him ever again? He'd had a week to decide what to do, and yet the answer still eluded him. If he let her win, she'd resent him for not taking her seriously. If he beat her, her pride would be injured to be knocked out in the very first round. If they drew, she'd be knocked out anyway because he had accumulated a higher score during the previous tests. Doomed. He muttered weakly into his pillow as the sun began to rise behind the Hokage monument. Doomed. All in all, he ended up with just 3 hours of sleep. Naturally, Minato being Minato, this was plenty, and he leapt up as fresh as a spring daisy the next morning to the sound of his alarm clock, almost as if he hadn't been kept awake the whole night by guilt. At once he made his way down to the indoor arena where the tournament would be held. A few jittery genin were already present, as spectators were beginning to dribble in. This was, after all, a fairly big event. Every Chunin exam ended with a tournament, and while this was a matter of great fear and trepidation for the participants, it was an opportunity for entertainment and bonding for everyone else, like any other spectator sport. The stands would get pretty crowded by the time the first match kicked off. Minato could see uniformed nin checking each spectator at every entrance, reminding him that while this was only entertainment as far as the villagers were concerned, this was also a politically volatile event. Every village sent spies to every other village's exams, and today it would not only be his fellow Konoha citizens cheering him on. Today he would be under the calculating scrutiny of elites from Iwa, Suna, Kyumo, Kiri, and AIM. He wasn't too worried, however. Rarely did this lead to any confrontations during Chunin exams. No village really cared that spies infiltrated these matches. It was a point of pride, it seemed, to show off new talent to old enemies. Minato found his team in their allotted changing room. AI was pumped and ready for anything, though her opponent had yet to be decided. Saburo, who, like Minato, had gotten a key in the last test, already knew his first opponent was Chi-Chi. It was hard to tell if he was confident or not about this matchup as he expressed himself so very little, but since Chi-Chi was a renowned weapons expert who could shoot a flea of a dog's back with a kunai, he couldn't have been feeling too cocksure. His match was first, anyhow. How you feeling? Jiraiya-sensei asked Minato when he appeared. Minato shrugged. He still hadn't really decided what he was going to do about Kushina. Why do you bother asking? AI groused. You know he's going to win the whole damn thing. AI-chan is a little nervous, Jiraiya said smoothly over the top of her head. This did more to ruffle her feathers than was probably wise. In fact, they were all a little antsy as not much was said while they sat and watched the rest of the genin and their teachers arrive, and listened to the increasing crowd noise in the stadium that was far more accurate than any clock in telling them the hour of their humiliation was at hand. But with 5 minutes before the start of the first match, Minato noticed that Kushina had not yet arrived. No one else appeared to notice this as the noise from the stadium began to reach a crescendo. When the stern examiner entered, Minato really began to panic. This was it, the test was finally beginning and yet there was no sign of Kushina. "Good, you're all here," the examiner said bluntly, whose arithmetic was apparently lacking, as she strode across the changing room to a whiteboard near the far wall. Here, she whipped out a pen and began drawing squeaky blue brackets across it, labeled 1 to 9. "The first 4 matches are already decided. The rest of you listen closely, your matches were decided randomly this morning and are as follows." She read out a list of names and wrote them down on the board as she announced which match they would take. Mostly this was taken in grim silence, but occasionally this resulted in a hiss of despair, like with the 2 boys who were drawn against the Hyuga twins, and Inoichi and Shikaku, who were drawn against each other. AI drew against the wild Suminazuka, and took this with a sniff and folded arms, so she must have thought her chances were pretty good. Yet where was Kushina? "Ah, Mitarashi-san," Jiraiya-sensei interjected suddenly. "Minato's opponent doesn't seem to have turned up." The examiner looked at him coolly. "If she doesn't turn up it will be an automatic forfeit and Namikaze will move straight on to round 2 with whoever won match 1. "She'll turn up," Minato insisted. For all his desperate calculations of all the variables that would take place today, he had simply not accounted for the idea that Kushina would just chicken out. That seemed absurd. It didn't correlate with the girl he knew at all. Sure, at the academy, she'd been a work-shy, highly unmotivated little toad, but even when everything had seemed hopeless, she'd never simply not turned up. She'd never given up. Come hell or high water, she'd always been sitting in her chair every morning, ready to be bombarded for another day with things she couldn't understand, enduring the suspicion from everyone that she was a no-talent idiot. She wouldn't give up now. "I don't see why you should get a free pass," I muttered to him. "I don't blame her. It's pointless fighting you, but at least have the guts to go down with a fight, the little coward." "You don't know what you're talking about," he whispered back through locked teeth. If Kushina wasn't here it was because something was wrong. Kushina wasn't a coward. She'd survived the collapse of her village and had braved trenches full of corpses just to retrieve a headband. The idea that she would be scared off by a match against him was laughable, and anyone who dared to call her a coward was ignorant beyond comprehension. AI could only wish she was half the girl Kushina was. "Saburo, Chichi," the examiner said at last, looking at her watch. "Please come with me." It was time. The 2 genin stood in silence, gathered their equipment, and followed the examiner through the tunneled corridor that led to a set of wooden doors. Jiraiya and Chichi's instructor went with them. The moment these doors opened, such a noise flooded in louder than ever at the sight of the first challengers. The 5 of them disappeared into the bright lights and the rest of the genin tiptoed after them to gather around the opening eager to watch the battle commence. Minato hung back. "Where is Kushina?" he asked nobody in particular. Mikoto's brother shrugged, eyes on Saburo and Chichi as the examiner blew on her whistle. "It's sort of expected a few of your opponents would back out." "Kushina wouldn't do that," he insisted. AI put on an airy tone of mockery. "Kushina wouldn't do that," she mimed. "Who cares what Saint Kushina would and wouldn't do? Most people would be happy their opponent hadn't turned up. Just act like a normal person for one day, Minato. The martyr act gets annoying after a while." "Hey you, just shut up." Minato snapped at her, earning surprised stares from everyone else in the admittedly crowded little passage. Even AI seemed a little shocked, gaping at him as she was. That was all Minato had, unfortunately. He wanted badly to rail on her and articulate exactly how unbelievably rude and unfair she was being in a way that would shame and humble her, but it was not to be. The fight was distracting everyone and the terrible tied tongue syndrome struck again. With too much to say and no way to say it, he simply paced and quietly fumed to himself. Kushina would be along any moment. Any moment now she would walk in the doors and... The doors opened. Minato spun around. In walked Hitaki Tsukumo, followed by a pale-faced Kushina. She took one look at Minato's elated face and sighed. "Why are you happy to see me, you idiot?" her expression seemed to say. But she did not look to him scared or angry or anything else he'd been worried she would feel. She did not look well perhaps, yet there was a grim determination to her features that said she was ready for anything. And so Minato could not stop smiling like an idiot. Kushina did not even get an opportunity to approach him before a shouted groan echoed from the stadium and half the genin hissed and cringed. A new roar of applause shook the passage and the genin at the doors parted way. Chi-Chi came back into the changing room looking sweaty but happy. Subiru didn't return at all. They took him off in a stretcher, Chi-Chi said, flopping down to begin reorganizing her weapons and scrolls for the next fight. Minato wanted to find out more, but at that moment the stern examiner reappeared to beckon to him and Kushina. This was it. Minato's mouth went inexplicably dry as he squared his shoulders, joined Kushina down the short walk through the tunnel towards the stadium. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. As usual, whenever something troubled Kushina she merely looked more annoyed than usual, but this close it was easy to see how tired she looked. How hard had she been training over the last week? Good luck, Minato, came some cheers from the other genin beside them. Pound her, Minato. That was odd. Normally when he sparred with someone, his friends always cheered for his opponent. It was so customary that he would win a fight that it was only decent to cheer for the underdog who had no hope. But Kushina was different. She was the outsider, and there was nothing they would enjoy more than seeing her fail. And then, out of the blue, kick his ass, Kushina. Mikoto shouted, louder than anyone. Well, after that, no one could think of anything else to say at all. Good luck, Kushina, he said to her too as they stepped out into the stadium. If she said anything in return, it was drowned out completely by the sudden roaring cheer from the crowd. This was, after all, the match they had all been waiting for. Minato was the village's darling new hope and his performance had been anticipated for years. Some might think that this was a lot of pressure and expectation to put on young shoulders, but the only person Minato really cared about pleasing right then was his opponent. They walked to the center of the stadium, a wide matted space covered with an inch or two of sand that had been disturbed quite a lot already from the previous fight. Minato blinked against the strong lamps above them to look for his sensei among the spectators on their raised stands, but perhaps he was still attending Subiru. It was doubtful that his father was there either. How odd, to have a stadium cheering his name but no one who really knew him. After a brief exchange with her teacher, in which he appeared to ask her something and she nodded jerkily, Minato and Kushina took a formal bow and took their places opposite one another. The examiner lifted her arm and pressed the whistle to her lips. The stadium went quiet. Suddenly the whistle blew and the examiner's arm dropped. A tentative sound of encouragement echoed from the stands, but neither opponent moved. They were still sizing each other up. What to do? Minato's mind raced. He could come up behind her in the blink of an eye and knock her to the ground with one hit if he so chose, but he hesitated, waiting to see what she would do. He would take his cues from her. Kushina moved, settling fluidly back into her trademark whirlpool stance, one hand raised behind her and one flat before her. Her foot lifted off the ground, offering a display of perfect balance, something he could upset so very easily faster than she could exhale. He still didn't move. Gradually the crowd began to mutter its impatience. They'd come to see a fight, hadn't they? And wasn't this the most promising genin of this century? Why was he just standing there? Kushina's eyes narrowed on him ever so slightly. Did she suspect he was holding back on her? Was that anger he saw rising in her face? Crap. Better move. A nice easy fire-based jutsu would do well here. Strategically it was weak against Kushina's speciality, wind, but impressive looking enough not to look like he was going easy on her. Kushina registered the seals as he performed them and performed her own, and as the ring of exploded at her feet and raced to encompass her, she merely stamped her foot and extinguished the flames with a burst of pure nature chakra. He closed the gap between them. Immediately Kushina shifted into her regular taijutsu stance, so familiar that he already knew the kata she was about to execute. He would block the arm that would strike from the right, and perhaps let her counterpunch land against his chest as it was weaker, then he'd block that kick with his knee and… Barely inches from her, Kushina's stance changed. Whirlpool style was gone. She'd stepped straight back into Konoha standard style and before he realized what she was up to, she'd kicked him in the stomach. Her first smacked his chin and her other hand landed flat on his chest. A moment later, he was bowled backwards by a surge of wind chakra that left him flat on his arse, staring at her incredulously. In a real fight, she might have just sliced him in half. The crowd was in shock. The faces peering from the entrance of the changing room were staring agog. Even Minato gaped. He'd thought he was in total control there, but for a moment it had escaped him. Take me seriously, please, Kushina said quietly, although only he could hear her. "I'm not going to let you win." He got to his feet and dusted sand off his pants. "I'm not going to let you win either," he said. "We'll see." Kushina swept up her arms and a blast of wind picked up a cloud of sand and whipped it around him. For a moment he was blind. He fought her chakra with his own, canceling the wind out so suddenly the sand dropped out of the air. The sight of 3 Kushinas greeted him, but only one could be real. He moved, faster than anyone in the audience of even Kushina could follow, and tackled the nearest clone. It dissipated. So did the second. So did the third. Ah! He heard the real Kushina's foot scrape in the sand behind him and turned in time to block another well-aimed kick, and noticed she'd moved back into her whirlpool style to confuse him. Giving her a taste of her own medicine, he blew her backwards and watched her roll head over heels away from him. He paused to allow her to stand, though she did so far too gingerly for how little he'd touched her. She was even clutching her stomach and looking especially gray, though he knew he hadn't landed any hits on her. A more enjoyable buzz from the crowd surrounded them now. People were still chanting his name, and most likely no one knew Kushina's, but this was a fight they hadn't expected and perhaps some were looking at this girl with new respect. Minato only let his attention wander for a moment, back to the stands in search of Jiraiya again, and Kushina took the opening. A column of sand attempted to smash him into the ground. He avoided it was a nimble sideways dodge, and when he looked around again, now 5 Kushina were racing towards him. That was fine. Once he took out these 5 Bunshin, the real Kushina would reveal herself again and perhaps he would stick her with a sky quicksand jutsu to trap her in one place. Faster than a bullet, Minato tackled the Bunshin. 1, 2, 3, they dissipated. 4, solid body met solid body and then went crashing to the ground. What? He blinked, realizing that the body trapped beneath his was perfectly real. Ha! She double-bluffed him, expecting him to assume they were all Bunshin and ignore them all this time. But that was one bluff too far for Minato. That would show her for overestimating his intelligence. God, she was so soft. Would you get off those? Kushina ground out beneath him, twisting around and looking terribly uncomfortable. Her face was getting redder. That was an improvement from gray, but it was still a bad sign. Minato looked down at the incredible softness he was grabbing onto and realized, for the first time, that the rumors of Kushina's proportions had not been an exaggeration at all. He stared, and no bra to speak of at all. A hard spike of a knee jabbed against his stomach and Minato hastily rolled away as Kushina attempted to headbutt him. For real. If she shot her wind jutsu at him now she definitely would slice him in half. Scrambling to his feet, Minato dabbed his runny nose with the back of his hand. It came away with blood. She got him. He distinctly heard someone from the changing room entrance scream excitedly over the din of the outraged crow. She drew first blood. Odd, Minato thought, sniffing and gulping back the flow of warm, metallic blood. He didn't think she had hit him. Damn, pervert. Kushina hissed, getting to her feet. She seemed to be having more trouble than him, clutching her stomach and standing with a stoop. What's wrong? He called, puzzled at her state now when they had sparred for longer and harder than this on several occasions. I barely touched you. Kushina didn't answer. She was nearly bent double now, gasping in pain. Something was very wrong. Minato ran over and touched her shoulder. Are you okay? He asked worriedly. Kushina, it's nothing, she snapped at him, beginning to blink back tears. Not of pain, perhaps, but of mortification. Ugh! This isn't fair. A whistle blew nearby and Minato saw the stern examiner jogging over. What's the matter with her? She demanded impatiently. The puzzled hum of the crowd filled the air like a swarm of bees. Minato, utterly confused, just shook his head. I don't know. I barely touched her and she started like this. The examiner rolled her eyes at him and shoved her handkerchief at him. Wipe your nose, for God's sakes. She turned to Kushina. There's nothing wrong with you, a little aspirin can't fix, she admonished. Is this your first? Kushina nodded, her face back to gray. Minato stared in bewilderment, unable to comprehend what was going on. Was this some secret code he hadn't been let in on? Was this Kushina's first what? Unlucky, the examiner said, with more compassion than Minato had ever heard in her voice. You can't fight like this, however, you'll have to forfeit. Go with the medic now. She gestured one of the white-coated medics over and palmed Kushina off on her. Her sensei, Hataki Tsukumo, appeared spectacularly fast to scold her as she was being led away. "I told you so." Minato heard him saying. Kushina's response was just a pained, angry groan. The examiner looked at Minato. "Congratulations," she said dryly. "You're through to the second round." "I don't understand," he said. "What's wrong with her?" She sighed with a faint shrug. "It happens occasionally. At this age, and with more and more girls competing, clashes occur." "What?" The examiner might as well have spoken Latin to him. She rolled her eyes at him again. "Her period," she said, in a way that seemed to suggest there was a silent, "You stupid boy," at the end of her statement. The examiner chose then to stride away from him, shouting the results of the match to the gregarious crowd, leaving Minato to make his own way back to the changing room where everyone clapped him on the shoulders and made funny of his bloody nose. "Got you good, did she?" Inoichi laughed. Minato went to sit down alone on one of the benches as Mikoto's battle against Chuza commenced, and that was where Jiraiya found him when he returned. "Minato? How was your match?" Minato blinked owlishly up at him. "Sensei?" he asked. "What's a period?" The rest of the day commenced pretty much as expected after that point. He fought the winner of the first match next, Chi-Chi, and knocked her unconscious in less than 3 seconds, for if you were fast enough to avoid her spectacularly offensive arsenal, it was easy to slip between her weaker defenses. This had been essentially what the spectators had been waiting for all morning, and a deafening roar burst out at his swift victory. His next opponent was Inoichi, someone Minato had been hoping to meet. It was true that he hadn't quite forgiven this boy for turning on him in the last test, and without the element of surprise and shikaku to back him up, Inoichi took one look at his opponent and knew he was screwed. As they took their places in the sand and waited for the examiner to blow her whistle, Minato warmed up a little with a few stretches, and then executed a practice kata so fast that Inoichi could not follow it with his eyes, and he stood staring at Minato in mute shock. Well, it had been a while since the days of the academy and he'd picked up a few things in his first couple of years as a genin that his school chums had no idea about. They all knew his speed was legendary but, holy shit! Inoichi muttered under his breath, and almost at once the blonde boy's arm shot into the air and he speedily forfeited the match before Minato got the chance to make him eat sand. A little disappointing, but this put Minato safely into the finals against Mikoto's own brother, who was far too full of himself to back down to anyone. With everyone else eliminated, it was just the two of them and this final match that would decide the tournament's champion. "Good luck, Minato," Uchiha Mikoto said quietly, who had been knocked out in the second round by said brother, which was, she said, something that probably wouldn't disappoint her father too badly. Though it was a pity he'd felt the need to break her wrist in order to win the battle, and now she was sitting with a medic getting it reset, and looking as gray-faced as Kushina had earlier. Minato wasn't sure he liked Uchiha Kasuke too much. As a rule, he disliked thinking badly of others who weren't particularly friendly, as who knew what kind of issues such a person had to deal that might have made them antisocial, unhappy, or difficult to communicate with. Kushina, for instance, was difficult to like by most people's standards, but by most people would fortunately never have to go through what she had, and Minato wondered how anyone who knew Kushina's history could possibly hold it against her. Kasuke was another matter. No matter how Minato looked at him, he was just an ass without an excuse. His life up until now was a glut of privilege. He had wealth, he had friends, a large and prestigious extended family, and, it was rumored, he had the legendary Sharingan. None of which entitled him to act like such a self-important bastard, or indeed break his little sister's wrist in a friendly fight. He had yet to even speak to Mikoto as far as Minato could tell, let alone come over and apologize or express any concern. This and the fact that he had, with AI, turned on Kushina and chased her off their team in the last test did not endear him much to Minato. Although Kasuke showed a fair amount of professional respect to him on most occasions, he'd never been warm to him or anyone else outside his usual little clique, comprised of fellow Uchiha boys. But that was how it was with most Uchiha. Although they were part of this village, and were in fact descended from the original founders, they always kept themselves apart from everyone else, living in their own little gated community and viewing everyone else as near invisible. It seemed like every other year there were rumors racing around that the Uchiha clan was going to split ways with Konoha and leave. Minato found that troubling. The number one rule of being a ninja was loyalty to one's village. The Uchiha, on the other hand, didn't care much for being ruled by anyone but themselves. Uchiha Kasuke typified every Uchiha stereotype that made Minato uncomfortable. He was also prodigiously strong by the clan's standards, and an ordinary Uchiha was already prodigious enough by normal standards. So Minato didn't know what to expect in this finale. He'd gone along with the flow of the tournament, untroubled and never in any doubt of his abilities. None of his opponents so far had demanded much from him, but perhaps with Kasuke he had to concentrate. He couldn't pull his punches as he'd done with Kushina, or rush the fight without a strategy as he'd done with Shishi. The intimidating flourish of speed had worked with Inoichi, but an Uchiha with the Sharingan would not be put off by a little fast handwork. This was a battle he would have to think about. Good, Minato thought. It had been a while since he'd had an opportunity to get serious in a fight, and Kasuke was one of the few people he could soundly thrash without feeling bad about it. So he was all smiles as the examiner called his name and he was led out of the changing room one final time to a loud, turbulent stadium who sounded more excited than ever. Probably with good reason. The village's darling against the most promising Uchiha of his generation. They were undoubtedly expecting something interesting at the very least. Opposite him, Kasuke wasn't smiling at all. He took all his fights seriously, whether they were against his little sister or the village's strongest genin, and while he didn't have much to lose here, he had plenty to gain. Anyone who beat Minato would probably be telling their grandkids about it many years from now, so he took his stance with a scowl of utter concentration. He was perfectly determined to defeat Minato at all costs. In fact, his expression kind of reminded him of Kushina's. With the shouts of support from the genin and the wild encouragement of the spectators, the scene was finally set. Minato settled into a loose, comfortable stance and focused closely on Kasuke, noting the tension was coiled too tightly in his legs and he was already sweating a little. Psychologically, Minato already had the edge, but he was experienced enough to know that advantages could easily be overturned by anyone who had just the right amount of determination. Hold, gentlemen, the examiner said bracingly, holding her arm aloft. On my mark, 3. Minato exhaled calmly. 2. Kasuke's eyes began to bleed red. Damn. 1. The whistle's shriek pierced the air and Minato quickly rolled sideways to avoid the blast of an extremely focused katan jutsu. The crowd was going wild, making it impossible to rely on sound in this battle. Vision was obviously going to be the most reliable sense here, and sadly, the Uchiha with the Sharingan had the advantage there. That could be changed. Drawing on the very same jutsu Kushina had shown him years ago when he'd been tutoring her, he summoned his chakra and pushing it into a vortex around him. The wind picked up, the flames fizzled out of existence, and the sand began to fill the air. The people in the stands would be very disappointed that their view of the action was suddenly obscured, but as long as Minato kept it up, the Sharingan would be less of a problem. But Kasuke was not to be done in yet. 3 figures surrounded him in the sandstorm, so suddenly that Minato barely had time to react and defend himself. A kunai flashed towards him, he blocked it with his own. Another cut towards his side. Minato slipped easily out of its range and drew a second kunai to fend off the third figure. The blows kept raining, faster than ever. Minato's body moved faster and faster, fluidly keeping up with the onslaught of 3 attackers, 2 kunai against 6, his hands whipping through the air faster than they had in a long time to meet and block, duck and dodge. Every time he kicked one clone away, another replaced it. Which was the real one? Were any of them real? The problem with his own sandstorm was that real Uchiha could be standing safely out of sight just a few meters away and Minato wouldn't know it. Damn! He would have to tackle the Sharingan head-on after all. With a shout, he released the energy from the jutsu and struck all 3 clones down. They disappeared as swiftly as the sand, and there was Kasuke, red-eyed and waiting for him. Minato ran at him. Kasuke, tracking his every movement with ease, met him blade to blade and forced him to duck another blazing fire jutsu. Just as planned, for when Minato came up he brought a fistful of sand with him and threw it into the other boy's face. Arg! Kasuke reeled back, eyes shut, and in those precious few seconds, Minato disappeared. Or at least, that was how it appeared to everyone else in the stadium. In reality, Minato was sitting in the stands high above Kasuke with a mid-level genjutsu cast around him to avoid detection from his neighbors. If Kasuke looked straight at him, his Sharingan would see right through such an illusion, but first he would have to pick him out of a crowd of 5,000. He was camouflaged up here for only as long as he didn't move, but that was okay, he just needed a moment to think. The Sharingan was a problem. Minato relied more than anything on his speed and against the Sharingan, a tool that deconstructed movement and allowed the users to anticipate even his kind of speeds, he was severely disadvantaged. It was not something he couldn't overcome with sheer brute force and stamina, but there had to be an easier way. Unlike the Hyuga, the Uchiha at least could not see out the back of their heads. This presented a possible weak spot. If he could just keep up a sustained attack from behind. He began to look around the tightly packed benches for some hint of inspiration. Down in the stadium, Kasuk looked around him warily, eyes watering slightly from the sting of the sand. There was no sign of his opponent, but even he knew better than to think Minato had bailed on the fight. He spun in place, looking for disturbances in the sand that might give away a hidden opponent. Was he underground? Was he in the stands? Kasuk began to scan the crowd. A shadow flashed over him, like a bird passing overhead. The Uchiha reacted quickly, throwing himself back to avoid the boy who slammed into the ground where he'd just been standing, smashing a tightly wound ball of such pure chakra energy into the ground that sand exploded upwards and the sound of the ground cracking drowned out even the spectators for a moment. Kasuk's shock at such a huge display of power lasted only a moment. Minato had missed. For a fraction of a second he was defenseless, and Kasuk moved in quickly to smash the hilt of his kunai against the back of the blonde boy's head. Minato exploded. Just a clone. After all that? How could a clone dash? No, it was just a diversion. The real attack had to be coming from behind. Kasuk spun just in time to deflect the kunai of another Minato who had dangerously close to catching him off guard. He slammed his fist against this Minato's stomach, and froze in surprise when this version too exploded into dust. Surprise! This time Kasuk didn't have time to turn. Something suddenly came down over his head, enveloping him in complete darkness that smelled oddly like old, sweaty socks. He struggled. What the hell? Had this guy pulled a bag over his head? He tried to grab it, to yank it off, but the ties of the sports bag had been pulled tight under his chin, and though given a few seconds he might have been able to unfasten them, it was already too late. A sharp, measured blow to his chest winded him. Another to his cheek knocked his thoughts loose. His legs were swept out from underneath him, and in those vital few seconds, he was already on his back, unable to comprehend more than the fact that, had this been a real fight, he would be dead now. The examiner's whistle pierced the air in 3 short blasts, signaling the fight was over. Minato straightened with a whoosh of a sigh and rolled his shoulders. That had nearly been a close one. For a moment there he'd thought Kasuk would surely notice him hiding there in the dust of the first clone, within the crack in the ground he'd opened up. Now he probably ought to give that sports bag back to the poor kid in the stands whom he'd stolen it from. Reaching down, he helped pull the makeshift hood off his opponent's head and then offered him a hand. Kasuk looked a little grudging but not too surprised. Had he really expected to beat Minato anyway? And the winner of the 24th Chunin examination tournament is, the examiner shouted over the din of the crowd, Namikaze Minato. Screams of jubilation broke out along the stands. Minato thought it quite over the top, but this of course was his first and only tournament he'd ever attended. For the spectators, many of whom had seen all 24 tournaments, few had ever seen a boy so advanced and impressive as this, and what they saw in his victory was a hope to see the end of the war, a hope for the village's security and its continued triumph over its adversaries. He did not appreciate the excitement the village felt when it saw him. Nor did he ever suspect the concern he had just inflicted into Konoha's enemies. Not until he heard those screams of joy turn to screams of horror. It happened too quickly for Minato to fathom. Why was everyone shouting like that? Why was his view of the stands suddenly blocked by all these bodies? Why the hell was Jiraiya-sensei lying on top of him? Minato? Minato? Are you okay? His sensei was shaking him pretty hard. Yeah, Minato said, stunned at such a fuss. Yes, I'm fine. Except his side felt rather hot. What was that? He looked down to try and figure out the cause, and all he saw was blood. Quite a lot of blood, actually. Was that his? A soft sound of surprise escaped him, and as the realization grabbed him that he was injured he began to feel the pain. It crept up on him slowly, unstoppably, growing worse until he could hardly breathe. Why? He gasped, fighting the searing agony that held him utterly rigid. He didn't understand this kind of pain. He'd just won the tournament, hadn't he? Where was Kasuk? With so many jonin swarming around, he could barely see anyone other than that strangely dressed man being pinned to the ground a few feet away by the strict examiner and several ANBU. How odd. They were all shouting at this man and wrenching his arms pretty hard behind his back. Was it even a man? Minato couldn't see the person's face for that strange gas mask he wore. Was he some kind of diver? He was a bit out of place here, lying in all this sand like Minato. They should probably take this person to the aquarium once they were done kneeling on his head. Seemed like he might be happier there. Minato? Jiraiya-sensei's voice sounded terribly faint. Minato, stay awake, the medic is here. You're going to be fine. I know that, he said, because it seemed obvious. And even though he disliked failing his sensei, he couldn't help it. He fell asleep. Chapter 6, Growing Apart. It was tempting to say that the next thing Minato knew, he was waking up in a hospital bed, but it was not nearly as simple as that. For a long time he drifted on the edge of consciousness. He was aware of the moment his sensei lifted him up off the sand and put him on a stretcher, and he'd heard his sensei hurriedly telling the medic that he was unconscious. Minato remembered thinking this wasn't really true. He was perfectly conscious, he just couldn't seem to be bothered opening his eyes or responding to all the irritating people who kept calling his name and shaking him when all he wanted to do was sleep. Then after that he was aware of lying in a bright room as lots of very professional-sounding people continued to paw at him, taking off his clothes and attaching things to him that he didn't care about. He remembered the needle going into his hand, a prick of pain that barely registered compared to the gaping hole in his side, and then for a long time there was nothing but blissful darkness. Apparently they had finally respected his wishes to sleep, not much penetrated that darkness. The low murmur of a medic's voice here. A flash of light in his eyes there. At one point he recalled rousing and feeling something uncomfortable pressing down on his face, and he lethargically struggled to push it off. Then a softly spoken woman had appeared some unknown time later to gently scold him and right the oxygen mask once more and then left him. When the cotton wool wrapped around his brain finally began to fall away, Minato sort of wished it hadn't. With clarity came pain. Gradually, when he opened his eyes they stayed open and he could take a good long look at his surroundings, from the beeping monitors, to the peeling paint on the ceiling, to the red-haired girl snoozing in the chair by his bed. Exhausted by even this small perusal, he closed his eyes and slept again. The next time he woke he finally felt like himself again. The muggy haze of exhaustion no longer numbed his thoughts and he lay in the pristine white bed, smelling of 5 kinds of disinfectant and feeling distinctly sorry for himself. There was no one in his room. That was awfully inconsiderate. He'd obviously been badly hurt. Didn't anyone care? Besides his solitude, the other thing he first noticed upon waking was his amazingly dry mouth. He remembered all that sand on the floor of the stadium and wondered if this was what it felt like to swallow a few gallons of the stuff. He looked around for some help and saw a jug of water and an empty glass on the nightstand. That would probably do. Now if only he could get his shaky hands to cooperate and grab that heavy jug without making a catastrophic mess. The door creaked open and Kushina walked in, stifling a yawn. "What are you doing?" she asked, seeing him engaged in battle with the water jug. "Want me to do that?" He sagged back to the bed, because that was far easier. Some unseen stitches in his side were aching like hell now and he was only too happy to let Kushina pick up the jug and pour him a fresh glass of gloriously clear water. He licked his dry lips at the sight. "The medic said you have to drink it slowly," she warned him as she handed him the glass, and she had to wrap her fingers over his to make sure he didn't drop it as he took his first grateful sip in what felt like a year. "How are you feeling?" she asked after his parched sigh of relief. So far Kushina didn't seem all that surprised to see he was awake and making a nuisance of himself. She didn't give him wide watery eyes either, as if she was even remotely worried about him. This was reassuring. "Okay, I guess," he said vaguely. He didn't feel great, but his level of discomfort seemed appropriate for the injury he'd sustained, so he couldn't complain. "Do you remember what happened?" Kushina asked curiously. He nodded slightly. There were obviously a lot of gaps in his memory and his understanding of what had happened, but he didn't feel too concerned about chasing up details right then. "Why are you here?" he asked instead. Kushina just looked at him and shrugged. He wondered if he'd made that sound like she should be somewhere else. "Were you worried about me?" he asked. "No." She scowled like he'd said something lewd. "Where's Jiraiya-sensei?" Kushina looked sideways, mouth twisting awkwardly. "He's gone," she said. "They sent him out yesterday, they sent a lot of people out yesterday. He said sorry he couldn't stick around to wish you congratulations when you woke up, but it was kind of urgent. Congratulations," he echoed. "For what?" "Landing himself in hospital. For passing the Chunin exam," she supplied. "Oh." he thought. How expected. He looked up at Kushina's closed expression and tentatively asked, "Did you?" "No," she said shortly, and scowled again like this was his fault, and it probably was. "It was actually kind of lucky you were hospitalized, or they would have sent you out too. They've already deployed everyone else who passed, Uchiha Kasuke, the Hyuga twins, Chi-Chi, Akimichi, Nara, and Yamanaka." "Wait, what?" Minato wheezed. "Deployed where? Why so soon?" "We're at war with the Rain Country now," she said with a shrug, as if this was inevitable. "Almost every Chunin and Jonin in the village has gone to fight." "How long have I been asleep?" he demanded. "Since when were we at war with the Rain Country?" Kushina raised her eyebrows at him. "Since they tried to have you assassinated," she said slowly. "Duh. I thought you said you remembered." He definitely didn't remember that bit. "I know I got hurt. I thought it was an accident." She gave him a slightly pitying look. "You're so naive," she sighed. "You just stood there like a lemming and this guy in a weird mask came out of nowhere. Everyone thought you were dead, you just weren't moving, Minato. Your sensei was so fast, I mean, not as fast as my sensei, but he still saved you. If he hadn't got to you, that weird guy would have stabbed you right through the heart." And Minato had never even noticed any of it coming. The assassin, the weapon, the killing intent, he'd missed all of it. Hell, he'd been on the ground under his sensei for several seconds before he'd even realized he was hurt. It humbled him to remember he still had a long way to go before he reached the level of a Jonin. Why would the Rain Country bother assassinating a boy who couldn't even see a hit like that coming? Was he really so much of a threat? He gestured for the glass of water again and Kushina obliging held it out for him, cradling the back of his head as he took another sip. When it proved a little too ambitious for his poor throat he began to cough, and Kushina was right there with a paper tissue to mop his chin. Minato eyed her warily. She could give the most hardcore tomboy a run for her money, but her motherly nurturing side seemed pretty competent too. "What about you?" he asked her. She blinked at him. "You didn't seem too well during the exam," he recalled. "Are you better now?" Minato was discovering he quite liked making Kushina go red, especially when she couldn't hit him. "A gentleman shouldn't ask a lady about such things," she muttered. "Okay." He didn't really understand all the secrecy about this topic. Even his sensei had been unfortunately vague when Minato had asked him what this period of business was, and the best reply he'd got was that it was a thing that happened to most girls once a month, during which time they became unstoppable killing machines. If that was true, Minato had been very fortunate indeed to escape with his life, but it was most likely that his sensei was doing his usual thing of masking discomfort with humor. He didn't want to ask Kushina straight out either, since she tended to mask her discomfort with violence, and even if he was hospitalized right now he didn't want to push his luck. Maybe once he got out he'd go find a book about it or something. "Still," he said. "You're okay now, right?" She smiled ever so slightly. "Yes. Thank you. But you should probably be feeling more sorry for yourself." "I am," he assured her. "Because it seems you're the only one who bothered to visit me." "Oh, I wasn't the only one," she said quickly. "Your dad came by. At least I think he was your dad." A cold sensation swooped through his stomach at this news. It was even more chilling to hear than the news that he'd single-handedly started a war. "He did?" he asked flatly. God help him, it sounded like Kushina had actually met him. How did he even begin to apologize? "Did you speak to him?" "A bit. He seemed nice." "Seemed nice?" She had to be joking. "He left this for you," she said, picking something up from the nightstand that had been previously hidden behind a bouquet of flowers. Minato glanced at it once and froze over. That was Mr. Nose, the bead-filled toy elephant he'd had since he was 5. The beads in the trunk had of course poured out long ago through a tear in the tip, leaving behind a flaccid scrap of cloth that had seen better days. Actually, all of him had seen better days. His ears definitely hadn't been seen in years. "I think it's some kind of anteater," Kushina said, turning the lumpy, gray blob with dangly legs over in her hand. "Ah, ha," Minato forced an embarrassed laugh. "Why did he bring that?" "He probably thinks I still sleep with him." This was not to say that Minato didn't still sleep with Mr. Nose. It was just that he'd rather die than let Kushina know it. Kushina, apparently convinced that Minato didn't share his bed with something so grubby, set Mr. Nose down and began to fiddle with the flower petals of the bouquet. A little card propped between two daisies showed they were from AI's mother, who had probably sent them very much against her daughter's wishes. Once you get better, I think they're going to send you out too, Kushina said sullenly, if what she had said before was true. I guess. Stupid, she grumbled. What did you have to go and pass for? I'll be alright, he said. In fact, the thought of jumping into the thick of war was quite an exciting prospect, not because he reveled in the violence of warfare, but because he had a feeling in his gut that he could make a difference. If he could start one, surely he could help finish one too. Kushina shot him a glare. You almost died, she pointed out. The guy who did that to you, that's the level of people they're asking you to fight out there. You won't stand a chance. He was a little affronted. Why not? Because you just existing annoys people, obviously. They nearly succeeded in killing you in your own home village, in front of dozens of jonin and the Hokage himself. They'll try again, and out there you won't stand a chance. Minato thought about this carefully. She was actually right. He was perhaps far more likely to be killed than any other much weaker Chunin for the simple fact that he would be a high-priority target for the enemy. And still, what should I do then, he asked. Stay home and hide under the bed? She rolled her eyes and looked away. Maybe that was exactly along the lines of what she'd hoped. You're as much of a ninja as I am. You wouldn't run from a fight, he pointed out. She shook her head. Knowing when to run is why I'm still alive, Minato, she said. I'll know when to run, he said, placating her. But that isn't now. People's lives depend on war. We have to do everything we can dash. Why isn't your life important, she demanded. Of course it is, he said with a shrug. If one life can save 100, there's nothing more important, and if you get killed before you can help anyone, he was silent for a moment, wondering if that was possible. To be killed without ever making a difference? That was a pretty sorry fate and one he planned to avoid at all costs. I'll be fine, he said simply, because he didn't know how else to communicate to her that everything would be okay. This experience hadn't shaken him and made him doubt his abilities, it had only strengthened his resolve to do better, be better. He would make sure that no one, not even a jonin, could catch him unawares ever again. And even though he couldn't explain it, he knew that he would live. Kushina hadn't been kidding about the war or the cause of it. How odd to be the reason why the streets were so quiet and the hospital so full. Once the medics allowed Minato out of bed, and they did so within days because they wanted to give said bed to someone else, he hobbled about on crutches feeling lost. His sensei had gone off to fight. Most of the genin he'd hung out with were on missions, or else were graduated Chunin now stationed on a distant frontier, and even the civilian population seemed subdued. Too weak to go back to work and too fit to stay still, Minato was stuck in limbo. He dedicated his mind and body to two tasks. First, he needed to get better. This task was coming along quite nicely as Minato spent many a night literally navel-gazing and poking at the interesting scar developing below his last rib where his stitches were rapidly dissolving and the tender flesh hardened and scabbed. His medics managed to turn his body's natural metabolic processes into another reason to praise him personally. After all, a normal person would be out for at least 3 months with a wound like that, but Minato was already able to run a few laps around the training field with barely a twinge of pain after only 3 weeks, and surely this was because he was a ninja prodigy rather than because he was young and healthy and a little hard-headed. His second task was to train. As soon as he could run, he ran. As soon as he could jump, he jumped. As soon as he could perform ninjutsu again, there was no stopping him from going back to work on the original jutsu he'd been working on for years, which he decided to dub Rasengan. What else could he do? Even Kushina had vanished with the rest of her team now that the workload for regular genin had increased tenfold. He supposed he could have spent more time with his father, but that was always a risky venture. Most parents might be a little surprised that their child had instigated an international war, or at least a little concerned. But not Minato's dad. The man seemed perplexed and suspicious of him more than anything. The medics had charged him with the care of a sick son who, they said, needed a lot of care and attention right now, yet this same son was doing star jumps the moment he rolled out of bed in the morning and rock climbing every other day. Minato's father appeared to have decided that if he couldn't understand his son, he probably shouldn't bother trying, and they left each other alone. But Minato did not escape everyone's notice. During his 4th week of R&R, and the 3rd week of the Rain Country conflict, he was approached by a pair of ANBU to be informed that the Hokage wanted to see him. Minato felt a little leery. His first thought was that he was in trouble, though he rarely did anything to deserve a reprimand off anyone, let alone the Hokage. But what if this was about Jiraiya's hinting about becoming the next Hokage? This thought made him quail even more. He didn't really want to be getting wrapped up in such serious business, and something about the Sandaime made him feel weirdly shy when in his presence. The man had such overwhelming gravitas. Minato, on the other hand, had none. Why would anyone think he was Hokage material? As it turned out, he'd gotten a little ahead of himself. When he arrived in the Hokage's suite, which was like a lavish penthouse in the administration building, the Sandaime said nothing of leadership nominations. "Please have a seat," he gestured to a soft-looking recliner set at an angle to a formidable-looking armchair. "I understand you've been healing well, but I'd still like you to be comfortable." Minato perched on the recliner awkwardly as the Hokage took the armchair. That seemed about right. Formidable man, formidable chair. Most people described the Hokage as a kindly old grandfather, but then the Hokage viewed most people as charming grandchildren. It was Minato he viewed differently, as a potential successor that needed vetted and guiding, so it was Minato who saw another side to the man, the one who, unbeknownst to children like him, was tired and jaded by dealing with would-be usurpers and secessionists and friends who smiled to his face and whispered mutinous words behind his back. In his eyes, Minato could grow up to be just another power-hungry dog snapping at his heels, eager to push him into his grave, or the greatest hope the world had for peace. So Minato wasn't being totally paranoid when he thought the Hokage's stare was a little too intense to be comfortable. "How are you feeling these days?" the Sandaime asked. "Okay," Minato said, hating the weak, squeaky sound of his voice. The fact that his voice had begun to break recently only revealed itself when he was nervous. "The village appears to be on tenterhooks with regards to your recovery. It's been a long time since we've had someone pass the Chunin exam with a perfect score, longer still since anyone tried to assassinate a genin. I imagine that this has been a turbulent experience for you, but the medics assure me that you haven't been adversely affected. They said it was just a flesh wound," Minato said. "I meant your mind, boy. Being struck down like that at the very beginning of your career as a Chunin might have destroyed someone else's nerves. Yet you seem unfazed." Minato stared at the Hokage, searching his wrinkles for some sign. Was it bad that he wasn't particularly traumatized? Should he have been? Did only idiots walk away from things like this with a whistle? The Sandaime smiled at him. "I see no reason to keep you confined to the village any longer. If you wish it, I shall send you to the border. I know many Jonin who would be glad to have a Chunin of your caliber under their command." Minato's heart leapt. "I can join Sensei?" he asked hopefully. "Jiraiya is engaging Hanzo's forces on the Rain Country border," the Hokage said. "For now they are holding out well, meanwhile the conflict with Kiri needs fresh blood. I'd prefer to send you there." The war with Kiri was the oldest of all the conflicts raging around the world. It had started 15 years ago and had claimed hundreds of lives on both sides. Minato understood the need for revitalizing the fight out there once in a while, but he had really been hoping to work alongside his sensei again. The Hokage sensed his disappointment at once. "Minato, a good ninja must learn to forge new bonds and work with new comrades. In order to grow, you must let go of your dependency on your mentor. Also, I've had complaints from the other Jonin about how much Jiraiya keeps you to himself. This will be a wonderful opportunity for everyone." "Yes, sir," Minato mumbled. What the Hokage hadn't elaborated was that Mist Country border was the furthest and most remote of all the war zones, and it was a conflict with no sign of ending anytime soon. There were people who had been sent there 10 years ago who were still there. If Minato went, how long would he be there? "You'll be dispatched in a week with Team Mitarashi," the Hokage informed him. "I believe she was one of your examiners during the exam." "Oh God, that was the strict one, wasn't it?" Minato gulped. But at least that was all the Hokage wanted to discuss with him, and he was quickly released back onto the street to figure out for himself how to prepare for his most crucial mission yet. His first thought was to tell his sensei, or Kushina, or even AI, or Saburo, or AI's mother, or even just the milkman. However, since none of these people were available, he went to tell his father instead. "Snice, son," slurred his father, who was mostly passed out on the couch when Minato found him. At least he wasn't accusing him of lying this time, but Minato didn't think his father had quite grasped that this meant he was leaving, possibly for a very long time. Resigned to the fact that he probably wouldn't see his friends for a very long time, Minato decided to write some letters to them instead, explaining where he was going and that they shouldn't worry about him. His letter to Jiraiya turned out pretty long. To Ai and Saburo, it was more like a brief note of courtesy. To Kushina, well, he couldn't really think what to say to Kushina. Knowing full well of her opposition to him being called up, it was hard to frame his mission in a positive light. Besides, he felt strangely self-conscious. What if she thought his comments stupid? What if she thought the whole idea of writing a letter to her was stupid? In the end, Minato didn't manage to come up with anything. Perhaps he would write once he was at the border where there would be all the time in the world to sit around and think of things to say to this girl. How irritating that it should be this hard to write a letter to this one particular person. No one else made him feel quite so much like a bumbling idiot as Kushina did, and she wasn't even in the village. How was that fair? It turned out, however, that he needn't have given himself a headache over the matter, as the day before he was scheduled to leave, Kushina returned with her team. When Minato heard Hatake Tsukumo was back in the village and at the hospital, he dropped everything he was doing, all the scrolls and weapons he was packing into a large rucksack, and raced over. This was not because he had any particular desire to see Hatake Tsukumo, but because he knew that if her sensei was back, then Kushina would surely be back too. The man in question was standing in the immediate foyer, standing with a group of senior-looking medics, one of which was talking in that slow explanatory way that meant something serious was going on. Minato hesitated. He didn't want to interrupt anything important, and he still had some lingering wariness of Kushina's teacher left over from the academy days when the children had talked about which Jonin teachers they wanted to be placed with, and most decided Hatake was far too fierce for their liking. So with great trepidation, Minato approached. Excuse me. Hatake-sensei. The speaking medic was the one who noticed him first, and only when he stopped talking did the white-haired man turn to look at him, as if looking for the source of the interruption instead of recognizing he was being addressed. It probably took a lot of work to become that frosty. Minato didn't know what he'd done to offend Hatake Tsukumo, but there was no running away now. Under that horrible blank stare, he somehow managed to fire his inquiry. Kushina. I mean, do you know where she is? After a painfully long pause, like he wanted Minato to suffer, the Jonin finally pointed. Room 45, he said. Minato took a sharp breath. Did she get hurt? Hatake Tsukumo shook his head slowly, no, and turned back to the medic, interruption resolved and over with. Minato quickly slithered away, quite glad that was over, and hurried on down the corridor that had been pointed out. It branched off in several places and crossed multiple wards, a route which Minato felt had warranted more than just a pointed finger from the Jonin, but he steadily counted the door numbers until he managed to find number 45. It was open, probably to allow all the medics and nurses to stream in and out freely, and there were a lot of them, giving him a direct view into the room where Kushina was sitting. For a brief moment he thought her sensei had lied. Kushina looked more shocked and pale than he'd ever seen her, and his first thought was that all these medical workers were attending to her. It took him several seconds to realize there was someone else lying on the bed in there, making awful whimpering sounds. Kushina was clasping this person's hand tightly. Minato only realized why she was staring at them in such obvious horror when the medics shifted aside a little and he got a glimpse of bright red, scorched flesh. It covered all of the boy's arm, most of his chest and a great deal of his face. A lot of his hair was gone. If it was someone Minato knew, he couldn't recognize him. Whoever it was appeared to be in shock. Despite the massive burns to his face, he was still talking, or rather, rambling. Minato edged forward into the room and heard the frantic mutters he was speaking to Kushina. I deserve it. I've done something to deserve this. No. Kushina whispered back, though her lips barely moved. Too slow. I was too slow. Oh, God, tell her I'm sorry. Yes. Kushina breathed. The head medic in the room finally noticed Minato when he turned and almost bumped into him. Please, he said with obvious impatience. This is not the time for visitors. Both of you, out. Minato realized that Kushina was only being evicted on his account, but she stood without argument and awkwardly extricated her hand from the burned boy's grip. He didn't appear to want to let go. Then she walked past Minato and out into the corridor. He followed her uncertainly but hung back. Once the door had slammed behind them, plunging them into the relative quietness of the corridor, Kushina didn't turn to face him. It looked like she was pressing the heels of her palms against her eyes. Who was that? Minato asked quietly. Big J. Big J? Minato spun with disbelief to look at the door as if he might be able to see through it and catch another glimpse of the patient. But he knew what he'd seen, and nothing about that boy had looked like Big J, who was so named because he was a tall, very round-faced Chunin, or at least he had been when he'd left to fight in the war a year ago. The boy in that bed had been as thin as a rake. Most importantly, "I thought you didn't like Big J," he said. Last he'd heard, Kushina had even broken this guy's arm. As far as bullies went, he was the worst. "I hate him," Kushina said emphatically, brushing away something from her face that were probably tears. "Then why dash?" "He was crying for his mother," she said shortly. Minato thought there had to be more to it than that, but when Kushina said nothing else, he wondered if it really was all there needed to be. Perhaps Kushina was too kind-hearted to turn her back on even her most loathsome of bullies when he needed help. "I'm sure he'll be okay," Minato said, since Kushina seemed unusually upset over this. "What happened?" She sniffed loudly and finally turned to face him. Puffy pink speckles surrounded her suspiciously damp eyes, but the effect wasn't particularly unflattering in Minato's opinion. "We were on a mission to deliver personal messages to the border, you know, the unimportant stuff, just like letters from people's ma's and scarves from grannies, that kind of thing. There was an attack while we were there. There was some kind of explosion. You could see the flames above the trees, and it was like half a mile away, but you could still hear the screams. Big J was brought back to the camp like that. The other 3 died right there when we were strapping them to the stretchers. The only one we managed to bring back alive was J. Oh." Minato watched her take a deep, shaky breath to calm herself. "They don't have any medics out there, you know," she went on angrily. "There were a couple, but they got killed off and now all they have are some Chunin with basic first aid trying to deal with everything. They won't send any replacements because they're too important to waste on a low-priority zone like that. Apparently there aren't enough casualties to justify sending precious medics. I was only there for half an hour and in that time 3 Chunin died and Big J's going to lose his arm and his eye. That's supposed to be one of the safest posts. What the hell's going on, Minato?" She gave a growl of frustration, though maybe it was more at herself, for she furiously rubbed her eyes and gave a great sigh. "I'm alright, I just can't stand it when boys cry. It gets me right here," she said impatiently, pointing to her chest. "These wars are just so stupid. Why can't everyone just stay home and stop picking fights with each other?" This put Minato in a very awkward situation. He had sought her to tell her he was finally fit enough to be dispatched in the hopes that she would share his excitement, but that didn't seem so appropriate anymore. Not when she'd just witnessed so much death and disfigurement of others who'd been sent out. "So what did you want?" she asked bluntly, probably because he didn't usually seek her out unless he had something to say. He was now left struggling for a new reason, but he'd have to tell her at some point. He couldn't just disappear tomorrow without ever having said goodbye. He began slowly. "I'm leaving." She blinked at him slowly. "Where?" He could tell she already knew, for a stillness had come over her that froze the air between them. "The Kiri border. Things aren't, going so well down there, so they want to send fresh blood dash." "That's probably what they'll get too," she retorted. "Fresh blood? Who came up with a stupid saying like that?" She'd have to take it up with the Hokage. "I know you're worried," he said quickly, "but I'll be fine. Didn't you see Big J?" She pointed at said boy's room. "Did he look fine to you?" "I think I'll manage better than that," he said with a shrug. Although accidents happen to the best of ninja, Big J was by no means anywhere near to being the best. "So what?" she demanded. "You think your life is the only thing someone can lose out there?" His eyes darted over her face, confused. What else was there? If he lost any of his equipment, he could always send off for some more or borrow someone else's, or plunder an enemy's supplies. Any other materials were superfluous. "You don't have a clue what I'm talking about, do you?" she said. "You think it's all fun and games. And then you become like Big J, who lost it even before the attack." "Lost what?" Minato asked. Kushina gestured emphatically. Okay." He wasn't sure what she meant. "War changes people, Minato," she exclaimed. "It ruins them." "Well, what are you shouting at me for?" he said, feeling intensely gotten at for something that wasn't even his fault. "I have a duty and I can't refuse it." "I don't want to refuse." "And why should it change me for the worse?" Because you're already so damn perfect, any change would be for the worse. She said it sarcastically, but she still grew hot in the face. Compliments apparently didn't come easy to her, even the ones she didn't mean. I can't help what I've been ordered to do, he went on. What would you prefer I do? Betray the village that trained me when they need me the most? Maybe you should, she answered petulantly. He stared at her. I can't believe you'd say that. Loyalty to your village it's everything. Konoha isn't my village, she said fiercely. How can you still believe that after all this dash? Whirlpool never got involved in these wars. We bothered no one dash. Because you were too busy fighting yourselves, he pointed out. You had people who gave up on loyalty and they destroyed everything. You can't hold your village up as the example when it tore itself apart. Fine, she snarled. Go get yourself blown up for all I care. I won't miss you. She shoved past him, stomping away down the corridor. Minato watched her incredulously. Then why did you take the exam if you hate wars so much? He called. You knew they'd have sent you out with me if you'd passed. Then at least we would have been together, she shouted over her shoulder. But forget it. I was stupid to think you might need me, not as stupid as you though. And then she was gone. Minato hung around a little longer to wait for any news on Big J's prognosis, but eventually he had to return home to finish packing and organizing all the belongings he would have to leave behind. Comparatively speaking, he knew he didn't have much compared to other kids, but there still seemed so much to leave behind. On the frontier there was only room enough for a few spare socks, a couple of pairs of extra underwear, and a small flint block for sharpening kunai. Mr. Nose would have to remain behind as sentry over his bed. There would be no place for his favorite yellow shirt where he was going, nor the paintings he'd taped to the wall as testament to his non-existent artistic skills. Jiraiya had always tried to tutor him in the way of the paintbrush as much as the sword, but even Minato's genius had limitations. In the waning light of the evening, he sat down on his bed and listened to his room. He would miss it. All his life it had been a kind of sanctuary where not even his father ventured. He was already missing it. He would miss his friends too. There would be more where he was going. There were always friends wherever Minato went, whether he'd met them yet or not, but most of all he would miss his sensei. Few people were irreplaceable in his life, and his sensei's absence would be an aching hole in his chest for quite some time. So perhaps the Hokage was right? He couldn't cling to Jiraiya forever. At some point he had to grow up, and then he would miss Kushina. She couldn't claim to be so worried about him that she'd entered the Chunin exam for the sole purpose of keeping him company, and then turn around and say she wouldn't miss him. That didn't square. But trust her to be the one thing that made him feel bad about leaving. This morning he'd been excited and happy, looking forward to a change of scenery and the next step forward as a shinobi. Now he sat here on his bed, feeling a little sick in the stomach to think of Kushina's angry words. Was that how it was going to end? What a stupid thing to fall out over. Before the light faded completely, Minato resolved himself to finding Kushina. He couldn't leave the village for God only knew how long on such a sour note. Even though it wasn't wise to search her out so soon after an argument, there just wasn't enough time to wait for her to cool off. And even if he was the one who had to suck it up and apologize despite having done nothing wrong, it would be worth it as long as they were able to part ways on pleasant terms. But although he searched quite thoroughly that night, Minato was unable to find her. He checked at the social center where she lived, but the bespectacled young lady who answered the door claimed not to have seen Kushina all day. He searched by the river, in the junkyard, around the upper tier of the markets, in the genin training grounds, anywhere he knew Kushina liked to hang out. He even collected his courage and knocked on the door of the Hataki household and braved yet another stony expression from the White Fang as he gibbered out a sentence that sort of sounded like, "Do you know where Kushina is?" Hataki Sakumo naturally said no, and Minato was forced to continue his search elsewhere. But little did he know that once the Jonin had shut the door in his face and returned to the living room, he had then asked the red-haired girl sitting on the hearthrug with his wife, "What did he do exactly?" To which the red-haired girl replied, while jangling her homemade necklace for their tiny baby's amusement, "Nothing. He's going away to fight and we fell out. I don't know what to say to him." Minato had to end his fruitless search after a few hours. He needed his sleep for the long journey ahead of him the next day, and he had to accept that if Kushina didn't want to be found then there was little chance of her being found. She was a ninja, after all. Not for the first time he went to bed with a restless mind, courtesy of a girl from Whirlpool. And for this reason, and perhaps the prospect of tomorrow, he slept uneasily and woke the next morning feeling sluggish and lazy. He stayed in bed for as long as he could, before dragging himself through the motions of morning routine. His bag was already packed, and he still had 10 whole minutes to get to the village gate before. Wait! His father. It occurred right then that no one had explained to his father that he would be leaving to fight on the border, or at least not when he was sober enough to understand. The man was still in bed, so perhaps he should give his shoulder a little shake to wake him and… No. Either his father wouldn't care or he would get angry for being disturbed, and Minato didn't have time for this. He grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled down a message to leave by the breakfast cereal. He kept it brief, saying that he was going on a long mission and he wasn't sure when he would be back, something that was fundamentally true, but still felt like a horrible deceit for explaining so little. He would write, he decided, a much longer letter once he got where he was going, then he would be too far away from his father to risk having any more bottles thrown at his head. Even such a brief note took a while to write. Minato glanced at his watch and hissed a mild exclamation. He needed to hurry or he was going to be late. He hastily signed the note and dashed from the house with his backpack. Would the group leave without him if he was late? Had he remembered to pack everything? Would he be halfway across the country before he remembered he'd left behind something vital? Fortunately, Minato had always been extremely fast, and he made it to the gate with several minutes to spare. The leaving party was already there, waiting for him. "Ah, here comes our star player at last," said his former examiner, Mitarashi Junko, who was most likely their leader for this journey. "Do you have everything?" "Yes, sir," he piped obediently. "All right then," she said. "I'll give you a minute to say your goodbyes and then we move out." "Goodbyes?" he repeated. The Jonin nodded to something behind him. "She's been waiting for you, I think." Minato jerked around in surprise. Kushina was standing by a grassy verge, looking distinctly displeased and awkward. She was keeping her distance. She had never liked big crowds of people and hated to approach him around others. Yet here she was, braving her dislike of human beings to see him off. Or, perhaps, shout at him some more, judging by her expression. Minato went over to her a little warily, glad at least that she had come out of hiding, even if it was at the last possible minute. He opened his mouth, ready to apologize for any cruel things he'd said about her village, but Kushina beat him to it. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "For before. I didn't mean to say those things yesterday. I was just upset because of Big J, you know." "I know," he said slowly, trying to recover from his shock. Was this the first time Kushina had ever apologized for anything, ever? "Also, I really don't want you to go," she said, fisting her hands in her pockets and glaring off to the side. "That upset me too. I have to dash." "I know. I know you have to," she snapped. "I'm just telling you I don't like it. I don't want you to go. I don't want you to get hurt again or change or anything." "I won't get hurt," he promised. "And I won't change." "You might," she said stubbornly. "What about you?" he asked. "What am I supposed to do if you get hurt or you change while I'm gone?" She looked shocked. "That'll never happen," she said. "I'll be the same forever. And you'll get bored of me after you go out there and have exciting adventures and meet more exciting girls." "Girls? Why girls?" "Okay. Boys then," she gasped in exasperation. "Does it matter? You're leaving me behind either way." He understood how she felt. He felt like he was leaving a lot of things behind this week, and Kushina was one of them. "I'll write to you," he said. "Every week." Kushina considered this offer with narrowed eyes, as if scrutinizing it for loopholes. "Okay," she said slowly. "You got to tell me if you get hurt or you meet any girls." "Again with the girls?" "Sure," he said. She considered him a moment longer, then withdrew something from her pocket and jabbed it towards him quite aggressively. "Here," she said. "Take this with you." Gingerly, he reached out and accepted it. A small wooden disc fell into his palm, attached to a leather thong. Upon closer inspection, there was a spiral relief on one side of the disc made of what seemed to be a kind of glue that was as hard as plastic. As a necklace it was quite amateurish, and it bore too much of a resemblance to the symbol of the Whirlpool Village to be a coincidence. Minato looked at Kushina. "Did you make this?" he asked. She shrugged and nodded. "On the Arts and Craft Day at the center," she said. "It's good," he said, meaning it. Even if the materials were crude, the spiral of glue was almost perfect. "It's really good, Kushina, thank you." It's a good luck charm to keep you alive, she said. You don't have to wear it or anything. I know it's stupid. Just keep it in your bag or whatever. No, I'll wear it, he said, and to prove it he immediately tied the thong around his neck so that the emblem lay proudly against his shirt. Kushina smiled a little, and a warm flush of pink crept over her cheeks. And as Minato ran his fingers over it in marvel, she refrained from mentioning her present had spent the best part of last night in a baby's mouth. Thanks, Kushina, he said again. It means a lot. Behind him, his leader called out. Namikaze, she shouted. We're going. I guess this is it, he said, grinning awkwardly at Kushina. Yeah. She said weakly. Take care, okay? I will. And, you'll still be my friend when you come back, won't you? Minato felt something painful squeeze in his chest. Kushina had never acknowledged him as a friend before, and he suddenly knew what his leaving was doing to her. He was her friend, and he was her only friend, and in a moment he would be gone. Kushina didn't have much else. He reached out and took her hand, like they were sealing a deal. I promise I won't change, Kushina. I'll always be your best friend. She hesitated a moment before her fingers squeezed back. Me too. I promise I'll wait for you. They smiled at each other. Either kiss her or get moving. Junko shouted. Minato and Kushina jerked apart like they'd both suddenly realized the other had a contagious disease. Snorts of laughter rang out from the leaving party, and Minato ducked away with burning ears to join them. They clapped him on the back good-naturedly and said things like, "Don't worry, the courage for girls will come in time." As they left through the gate, he turned and waved to the red-headed girl he was leaving behind and she waved back just as exuberantly until they passed over the crest of the hill and she was out of sight. He didn't see her again for another 3 years. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.